So, guys, we are going to be doing the traditional getting out of the boat story, which is about Jesus walking on water and Peter trying to get out of the boat to follow him. But that's the basis of the story, and I'm gonna jump into all the background behind it and that sort of thing now. So we're in a situation where Jesus is, I think, it's at Capernaum. Jesus is with his disciples, and he sends the disciples ahead to Capernaum. Now, to get to Capernaum, where they are, the quickest way is over water. So what he does is he says, "You go down to the boat and start standing across to Capernaum, and I'll catch you up." There's no question. There was no question amongst them, or perhaps they were talking about that. It's just not recorded in the Bible of how's Jesus going to catch us up? Has he got another boat? Is he going to come across on the boat on his own? Anyway, but that's how it is. Jesus sends them across to Capernaum in a boat, and he then is going to follow later. I always get the feeling that the disciples were really sent to almost test Jesus' patience, because sometimes they could be a bit annoying about the things they get involved in, and that Jesus often is just like having to correct them, just steer the way they think, and then just talk to them about what their questions, what's going on in their minds. But whenever you see Jesus talking to, I'm off piece here. I don't always do my preachers. Whenever you see Jesus talking to the disciples and teaching the disciples, he never gives straight answers. Because for Jesus and the disciples, he only has 3 years with the disciples. And what he's trying to do, he's trying to change the way the disciples think. So they think in a godly way, in a biblical way. That's what Jesus does. So he doesn't just provide an answer to the question they ask, or an answer to the situation they're in. What he does is he says, "What do you think about this situation?" Or he'll provide a story, a parable. And he says, "So what is the answer to that?" And they're like scratching their heads like, "What is Jesus on about? It's so complicated." But what he's doing is getting them thinking along the ways. So teaching for Jesus isn't about laying out loads of facts and figures in front of disciples. It's about him trying to change the way they think. And in this story, we see that again happen. So we're going to start on Matthew 14, 22 to 24. If you've got your Bibles there, you can check to see what I'm putting up is correct. If it's not the way it's correct, I have been known to make mistakes. In fact, I did find a mistake when I was preparing these notes from a time when I've used this set of slides before. So Matthew 14, 22 to 24. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side. But while he dismissed the crowd, after he dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Obviously, he's thinking, "I've had these in my ear all day. I need to go up and pray on my own. So I'm going to go up on the mountain, find some quiet space, and just pray on my own." If you've got children, sometimes you understand that. We've been trying to think about if I want to find time to pray. So he goes up the mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat had already gone a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. So the water was obviously getting very windy out there, and it was getting quite rough. And Jesus was left on this side of the water on his own, and the boat is some way out on the way to Capernaum. So what I want to talk about really is about the whole concept of the fact that the disciples are sitting in this boat, which is the place where Jesus asked them to be in life at that point in time. The place where he wanted them all to be, all 12 of them, was with him. So he called the disciples to come and be with him over a short period of time, and then they stayed with him for 3 years. Before, spoiler alert, he dies. We're not going to get onto that bit here. But their calling was to be with him. And at that very moment, their calling was to be in that boat and go across to Capernaum. That's what he had told them to do. And that's exactly what they were doing. So they were in this boat. In some ways, you can take that as being a position of where they are in life, as this is where we are in our life. So we are here in Epsom Church because this is where God has called us to be. Now, some of you might not be part of Epsom Church. Some of you might be visiting. Some of you might be having a look at the church. Whatever that situation is, for those of you who feel that your place is in Gateway Church, This is God's calling. This is your boat He's put you in. And I think if we remember back to Brittany in worship, she starts off worship by saying, we don't have such things as coincidences. You are not in this church by coincidence. You're not in here just because this is the church on your doorstep, or just because this is the church. I mean, this is the way you might feel about it. This is the way one that looks comfortable. There's only so many people in the church. I don't like big churches. I like this church. I want to be in this church. That's the way your mind can tend to think. But the reality of it is, God has put you here. However you've come to be here, God has placed you here. This is the boat He has put you to be in. And this is how you're outworking your part of your Christian walk with Him as being part of community and church is in this church. As Britt says, not by coincidence. Actually, God, in Ephesians 2, God says, it says in there, in Paul's writing, it says in there that God has pre-planned the works He has for you, which is a fascinating concept, and it's a demonstration of God sitting outside of time. So God does not sit inside our time pattern. He creates a time pattern, but He sits outside of it. So He can plan before things to take place before they've actually happened. So in Ephesians 2, it says, all the works that you get involved in are pre-planned for you, and you can take that as being pre-planned since the beginning of time, because God sits outside of that. And so whatever you get involved in was planned a long time ago. It hasn't just come by coincidence. This is how the sovereignty of God works. And it's in Ephesians 2. So we sit here in the pre-planning of God because we've been called to Gateway Church. This is our boat. As the disciples' boat was one which was being rowed across or sailed across to Capernaum. So line 24, it all starts getting a bit rough, and the wind and the waves are hitting it, and it's getting a bit rough. And to be honest, that's their boat. Our boat is not going to be necessarily going to be an easy journey. If you ask Rob and Abby, they'll say that the movement of this church plant, the history, the story of this church plant has had its ups and downs. There will be times when it's been really great joy, sometimes when things have been difficult, sometimes when they've been laughing, sometimes when they've been crying. And that's the way that God has things. Nothing is guaranteed, as Jo said in her testimony, nothing is guaranteed to be an easy ride for us. God doesn't promise that. Because you've become a Christian, Sam, you are not going to have an easy ride in your life. Necessarily. Not necessarily. But He does turn bad things into good things. I can't remember if someone brought that this morning as well. Pretty good. So what I would say to you guys is that sometimes it's not easy to see God in the situations that you're in. So these guys sitting in a boat, they know that Jesus sent them across in the boat, but they're in a storm. Their probably thoughts are, He sent us in this boat and it's stormy. Didn't He know? Didn't He check the weather beforehand? We're stuck in the middle of this inland sea going across to Capernaum, and actually we're going to sink and we're all going to die. What's that about? I thought we were supposed to be with Jesus, we're going to have a good time and just listen to the rabbi teaching and just see all these fantastic miracles that we've already heard of some already. And it's like, and here we are about to die. And that's what they're probably thinking. They're probably panicking and worried about what they are. We, on the other hand, in our walks, in our life, sometimes we face difficulties. Sometimes we face easy things. But our ride is never going to be just a smooth ride. God doesn't promise that. He actually promises that actually some things for us are going to be very difficult. One of those things is talking to people who don't know Jesus, and how rough that can be and how difficult that can be. So if we move on to the next slide, so we just move along on this story. So now we're on to 14, 20. So we move on to lines 25 and 26, the next few lines in this story. And shortly before dawn, Jesus went to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw Him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. When we read this story, we know that Jesus walks on water. He's the guy who walks on water. He's the guy who turns water into wine. We know these stories. So when we read this story, we read it with a sense of, yeah, He's walking on water, so what? For them, they've never, ever even thought about somebody being able to walk on water. And all of a sudden, they see this figure in the distance, in the waves. I've got a picture of it. Thank you. Picture next. In the waves, walking across the water, and all they can think about, it's a ghost. It's got to be a ghost. It's a spirit. Only spirits can walk on water. That's what it is. And they're all ducking down, probably hiding in the bottom of the boat because they're worried this spirit, all dressed in white, because we all know that Jesus always was dressed in white. Yeah. That's what the films tell us anyway. And so here he is walking towards that boat, probably not that rough. Maybe it was. And he's going towards them, but they're like ducking down. It's a ghost. No man can walk on water. And they're not even thinking it's Jesus. And then Jesus speaks to them. So we go on to the next bit of scripture, and the next line, and it says this, lines 27 to 30. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. So immediately he says to them, like, it's don't, because he's like, he knows they think he's a ghost. They know that they think he's some sort of evil spirit or whatever. And so his immediate response is, don't be afraid, take courage. Now, Peter, in this, he's looking across, he can hear Jesus' voice. He recognises what he thinks is that voice. He's like, I think that is Jesus. I think that's Jesus. And so he shouts back, he replies, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. Now, Peter's no fool. He knows no one can walk on water. He knows this sea is rough. He knows it's very deep. He knows he is going to die if he steps out on water. Now, he's a fisherman, so he's used to water, but he knows he's going to go straight in and probably die in his sin. But he sees Jesus walking on water, and he's thinking, well, if that is really Jesus, and he has got the power to walk on water, I've seen his other miracles, then perhaps he can do it for me as well. So all of a sudden, he's like, I believe that's Jesus, but I want to test him in a way. And the test is, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. Because he knows if Jesus tells him to come, Jesus will also provide the power to walk on water. So Peter receives the call to get out of the boat. So the boat, even though there's a chance that the boat might capsize or whatever and sink and die, anyone in it die, the boat is still relatively safe compared to stepping out into this stormy water. And can you imagine if he's on the edge of the boat and he puts his first foot into the water like this, and he's probably thinking about, should I let it touch the water? Does it hover above the water? Will it go a few inches under? If I step right onto it, what's going to happen? So he's probably like this with his one foot. He doesn't just all of a sudden appear walking on the water, does he? He must have thought and be in a panic. I can't do this. I can't step out. But he's heard that word ringing in his ear. Come. This is Jesus calling him. Jesus says, come. So he takes that first step and probably realises straight away, my foot feels like it's standing on solid ground. Even though the boat's rocking and it's in water and it's like tipping up and tipping down and all this sort of thing in the waves, yet he puts his foot on the water and it's solid. So he feels this is safe. I'm still going to hold on, and puts his second one out, still holding on. And then probably his third one on, but he's not going to let go, because if it just collapses, he can just jump straight back in the boat. And then in the end, yes, he knows he has to let go of the boat, let go of the rim of the boat. So he does, and he starts to walk across to Jesus. So he steps out of his boat. Now, in life, we have many callings over us, and each person generally gets different callings to the next person. So I know that Arvi is one of your worship leaders here, or the main worship leader here in this church. And I know that if I was more regular attender at this church, you still wouldn't be choosing me to lead your worship. That's not my calling. Whereas Arvi obviously knows that actually this is what God wants him to do, to lead worship. So he takes that role in leading us as a church, you guys, into the presence of God. That's his role, and he knows that that's what God set on his heart to do here. Whereas for me, I know that's definitely not my role, and each of us can have different sorts of things in it. And I know we got that word, didn't we? And it's a really interesting word that Sam brought about God's calling us to be, not do. And I love words like that, because it takes away all of the pressure that. So, Joe.
Joe.
It's like my name's Joe.
Yes.
Did you remember that?
Joe 1 and Joe 2. So Joe 1, because that was the first interviewer, Joe 1 was being called. Joe 1 was saying, we are, God's calling us to be and not to do necessarily. And I love those words because the pressure is away from us having to do something or to be something in church and have those expectations of people around us on us with those expectations. And but on the other side of it, our doing never ever should come without our being at the same time. So where I love that word is particularly because some of us get caught up, many of us can get caught up in church doing without being. And so we do things because we feel it's a responsibility or we feel we should be doing them and not actually because we feel that actually this is what God wants. And sometimes, let me just say that if you're seeing that there's a need in the church, so like we're running low on children's workers or anything and you see there's a need there, then actually that's not that can be the calling of God on you for that period of time to go and help with the children's work. That can be the calling of God. That's not just you thinking, oh, I'm just going to do this off my own, off my back. That can be the calling of God. But the reality is, the doing comes with being. So for Peter to step out of the boat, he was actually called to do something. There was an action that he was called to do, and that calling was to come. All Jesus wanted him to do is to come to him. So that was Peter's calling. But in that calling, Peter had to be as well. And actually, Peter doesn't be as well, and that has almost disastrous consequences we'll see later in the story. But I'm not going to jump there this soon. Quickly. What I am going to say to you is that there are many different roles in the church, but each one of these roles is a being as well as a doing. Is a being as well as a doing. So, for example, I've just talked about RV and worship leading, but what about evangelism? Pastoral work. Welcoming people into the church on a Sunday morning. Working on PA. Giving. Hospitality. Ministry to the poor and needy, preaching, finance, singing, administration, witnessing to a neighbour, work colleague or school friend, bringing words and prophesying. Prophesying being when you hear God speak to you and then you bring it back to the church, which is what Joe 1 did earlier on. He said, I think you started off by saying, I feel God is saying this. And that's God. He feels that God said that to him to bring to the church as a message from God to us. So that would be a prophecy. Supporting a sick neighbour, taking a particular job even in your life, could be God's calling upon your life. Or even marrying a certain person could be God's calling on your life. All of these things are where God might call you. If you're going to do it for the first time, if you're going to step into something like this, you might have heard on that list, actually there's something on that list I'd quite like to do or get involved in. There's something on that list which sounds quite interesting. Youth work, children's work, all of those sorts of things. And actually, what is the safest thing for you to do is not get involved in anything in church and just come to church and listen and worship and then go home again. That's the safest thing. That's the boat that you're currently sitting in. But God sometimes calls you to get out of that boat and get involved in another way. And that might be as much as bringing a word to church. Or it might be that you're called into taking a role.
Been chased off the stage.
So,
she's on the way.
now, interestingly, when you look at these, I look at these words. Peter knew before Jesus told him what he was going to be asked to do. So Peter tells Jesus what to say to him. He says, "If it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." So he's got an idea that he knows Jesus is going to ask him to come there, or he feels that that is the way it's going to be proved. And so he said to Jesus, "Do this." And so Jesus does do it. And Jesus does say, "Come." So Peter's role,
Peter's getting out of the boat is something that he's already feeling that this is something for him to do. And the same goes for us as well. So when Joe and I first got into youth work, actually, our calling on that wasn't that we're standing in church feeling like, oh, we need to get involved in youth work. What we did was we were just in church, and then the youth leader, the church leader came up to us and said, Rob, we've got the youth work. And I was thinking, oh, he wants me to be the youth leader. And I've got somebody else to lead it. I was like, oh, okay. But could we do it in your house? I was like, yeah, okay, do it in our house then. And so it was based in our house, and we had another couple who were leading it, and Joe and I would just go like making drinks and stuff. And then within 3 weeks, 4 weeks, the couple was saying, we don't really know how to talk to these young people, so we'd like to give up. And so they gave up, and we carried on, and then we led them for I think about 6, 7 years, didn't we, Joe? And we brought them here, our youth group here, many times, and it was great fun. Yeah, great fun doing it. But that was part of us answering our calling. We got out of our boat at that stage, because when he came and said to us, when the couple said, look, we don't feel that you can talk to us, we went to church leaders and said, they don't want to be youth leaders anymore. What do you want to do? And they said, well, could you do it? And then that was our option then, to step out of the boat or not. But that was like Jesus calling us into the water. We were like, we'd seen what had happened. We'd seen this couple who had literally not failed, but they had struggled and couldn't do it. And so we could be the same. We'd never done youth work before. Like, yeah, Joe, you've done children's work, but not youth work. And so when we stepped out of the boat, it was something totally new and totally something that we could have ended up sinking into the water, drowning in this, because we didn't know whether we would have the ability to do it. We wasn't at that point absolutely certain that God was in this. We had to go away, pray about it, to think about it, to talk about it, talk through it with our leaders, what was expected of us. And in the end, actually part of it was that we had a month of a couple trying to lead it, and we're thinking, actually, we would do it this way, we do it this way. And so we changed that. So that's what happened. So, when Peter gets out of the boat, he is focused on Christ. When he asks him the question, his focus is on Jesus. When he steps out of the boat, all of a sudden, he realizes what he's doing. He realizes what he's signed himself up to. He gets out of the boat and he steps into the water, and he realizes, actually, I'm standing on water in the middle of a storm, going across to someone, doing something which nobody can actually do. It's an impossibility. So he's standing in the middle, and he starts to realize this, and it starts to dawn on him. And all of a sudden, his focus goes off of Jesus and onto the fact of, am I going to sink? What is going on here? Is this next wave going to wash me away? What's going to happen? And straight away, his focus starts to move away from Jesus. And that can be something which happens to us as well. Focus in our lives can take us off. So it could be the same, but I'm going to use you, RB, a lot, because I know what you do. So it could be for RB. So RB could be almost like, well, do you know what? There's a lot of things that happen on a Sunday morning, and I know God's called me to lead worship, but I'm not saying you've got to lead worship forever, RB. I'm not putting you in that box. But I know that God's calling me to lead worship, but what about these other things? I might quite like to stay home and watch the replays of the Premiership from the day before. Or actually, I think God might call me to do that. That'd be good. So just so when I go to work, I can talk to my friends about football and witness them. You know what I mean? It's like there's a spiritual reason. You can think up any excuse to do that, and actually, your focus comes off of what you were originally setting out of the boat for, and your focus comes onto what's on your surroundings around you, and you get pulled away from what God has in line for you. So let me just ask you a question. For some of us, when I talk about things like this, some people say to me, I haven't got a clue what God's called me to do. I haven't got a clue how God wants me to be, or how he wants me to be involved in my Christian walk with other people, whether it's in church or outside of church. I don't really know what God wants. And I had a friend who was in a similar position. So when I got saved, I was about 26, 27, and he was about 35. And there have been many years where he'd been sitting, waiting for God to tell him what he wanted him to do. And I said, what do you really want to get involved in church? He said, well, he said, I don't just want to choose, I want God to tell me, so I'm waiting. I said, how long have you been waiting? Well, since I've become a Christian, really. It's about 20 years. And I knew him and was with him for about another 12 years at that point. And still at that point, when the last time I'd been to his house, he was still waiting for God to tell him what to get involved with. I just wonder whether he will get to the end of his life, maybe he's already been there, and he'll just look back and think, perhaps God didn't want me to wait. Perhaps God wanted me to look around and see what's needed. Perhaps God wanted me to look in the Bible, because the Bible talks about it all the time. The Bible talks about us being a witness to our friends, to our school friends, to our neighbours, to our work colleagues. The Bible tells us to do these things. He doesn't tell us to sit and wait until God tells you to do those things. He doesn't say, wait until I tell you to do these things. He says, no, go and do these things. He talks about church and the way church is constructed. He talks about worship in church. He talks about doing pastoral work in church. He talks about doing children, looking after children. And all those sorts of things happen in the Bible. And you see them in there and you just think, oh, actually, these happen in the Bible. Perhaps I'm supposed to be doing some of these things. So we get these things from God speaking to us through the Bible, from God giving us words, or from us just knowing or feeling a place in our lives. So I've just written down a few things where you find out. So in reading the Bible, talking to your friends about it, what do you think would me to be involved in church? Talking to people who know you is really helpful. But also talking to people can cause you problems. So Joe and I, when we were leaving our first church, after being there for 7 years and leaving youth work there, which we were leading, and as we were leading, we got the call of God for us to go and start planting churches. So we were on our way. And I remember in the few weeks before we were leaving, one of the church leaders coming up to me, not a senior leader, but one of the church leaders nonetheless, came up to me and said, Rob, God said to me that you shouldn't leave the church until you found successors to take over the youth work. I sort of looked at him and thought, well, God's told us to go now. And I was about to question him, and he was off and he was running. So he just dropped the bomb on me and said, don't leave until you've got another youth leader to take place, and then was gone. And I was like, oh, perhaps I am. And straight away I'm thinking, perhaps I am meant to stay to wait. But it could be years before the next youth leader comes along. What am I supposed to do? I talked to my church leader, and he said, if God's calling you to go now, go now, he said. This is probably this person speaking to you out of the desires of their own, wanting you to stay as youth leader in this church. So off we went to planting churches. And the same happens to Paul in the Bible. So Paul has got this word from God to go to Jerusalem and preach the gospel there. And then this prophet called Agabus comes up to him. This happens in around Acts 20, 21. And Agabus goes up to him and says, here's a prophecy about when you go to Jerusalem, you're going to be put in chains. And all the people around him, they say, right, that's a word from God saying you shouldn't go to Jerusalem. Definitely a word from God. And actually, no, it wasn't. Paul says, no, that wasn't. The word is that I am supposed to go to Jerusalem, but Agabus's word is correct. They are going to put me in chains. And that's what happened. So the interpretation of the prophecy was wrong, but the prophecy was correct. And that's what happened to me and Joe when we were leaving our church. So you have to be careful when you listen to things, because sometimes what you're called to step out of the boat to do isn't always what God wants of you. Sorry, when I say call out of the boat, when God calls you out to step out of the boat, and then someone steps in and says other things over you, that's not always what God wants of you. So I just want to talk to you about fears as well, because I think when we talk about stepping out in things involved in church, or talking about witnessing to people, or all the sorts of things that we can get involved in terms of church, quite often there are things that hold us back from doing those things. So it could be words from people in your past who have spoken things over you, said, actually, I don't think you're a very good speaker. You know, I've heard you speak to a group of people before. I don't think you're a very good speaker. And then actually you never, ever want to preach, because in your mind, every time someone says, would you like to preach that at some point? You're thinking, no, someone's told me I'm a bad speaker. And that stays in your mind. And what has happened is that bad word has defined who you are. Or your parents might have said, you're going to amount to nothing. They might continually say that because they think you've been naughty, or they want to say things over you. What they're saying to you, you're going to amount to nothing. You are so stupid. And actually, when it comes to doing something in church, and maybe Rob comes up and asks you, says, well, look, we need a hand here. Would you be able to help? And you're thinking like, no, because I'm stupid and I'm going to amount to nothing. And these words that are said over you can define you. These bad words that are said over you define who you then become. They define your personality in a way. And you become complicit in the lie that is said over you. So it happened to me. So because my writing was so bad as a primary school, I was the last person to use a biro. So in our school, you had to write in pencil until your writing was good enough, and then you got a pen. I was using a pencil for 6 months whilst the rest of the class had the biros. And every day it was, come and get your pens from the front, and Robert, get your pencil. And that was it. Every day I was reminded that I was the one with the pencil. So I had to go forward and get it. And so because of that, I got labelled as being thick. And so when it came to the chess tournament in the school, I was good at chess. And to be honest, you have to be quite bright to be good at chess. And we got to the final, and I won the final. But we did it in a break time, at dinner break, and it rolled on. I won the final, and we came back to my class, which was already in the classroom, with my friend who was from the same class. And he said, the teacher said to us, she said, so who won the final then? She didn't even look up, she said, who won? And I said, I did. And she went, don't be stupid. Martin, did you win? Martin was, no, he won. Why are you saying that? You won, didn't you? No, it was him. Rob won. And I got defined in my mind, that became who I was. I always thought that I was going to be thicker than everybody else because that's what she was trying to lay on me. And she laid that on me I had that teacher for 2 years, and she was also the headmistress of the school, headmaster of the school. And I was like, that's who I am. But these words can define you. What we have to know is that our past should never define who we are. It's only God who defines who we are. It's God who gives us our character. It's God who gives us our strength. It's God who gives us our abilities. We are not defined by our past. So when something in front of you happens, like, oh, hold on, we do need a youth worker in this church. Now, Ed does it at the moment, but he's like, in Germany, he can't do it. We need someone here. I think I could do it. Then you need to speak to Rob about it. And do not allow any fears that you've got that have been defined by your past to get in your way. When Peter steps out of the boat, he is not allowing the fears of his past to define him. He actually steps out of the boat because he's empowered by the fact that Jesus is saying he can do it. It's only later, as he starts to walk across the water, that he starts to sink, that things start to go wrong. So he steps out of the boat. And sometimes our bravery in stepping out of the boat can be things like praying out for the first time in church, or bringing a prophecy, or sharing something. So Abigail brought a prophecy in worship. I don't know if you remember it. She brought a prophecy where she quoted Proverbs 3. And she said, what was your prophecy, Abigail? It was something like, the Lord...
Trust the Lord with unbelieving, not on own understandings.
Trust the Lord. So that word was designed for this preach in a way, in what I'm saying. Trust the Lord your God and not your own understanding. So actually, when God calls you to do something, it's because what he's saying is trust God that you can do this, but do not rely on your own understandings of who you are or what you're capable of. If you do that, you'll end up doing nothing sometimes. Or some of you will end up doing things you shouldn't do because you've got such an elevated feeling of who you are. Because some of us can be really sort of like proud, can't we? And some of us can be really like self-depreciating. It works both ways in human beings. But actually, what we need to do is do what Proverbs 3 says and trust in God. So, Abigail, I believe that word of God was a word from God this morning. And I felt that when you said it, that what we was hearing was God speaking from your mouth as you brought it. And I just felt God say to me to point out to you that is a clear gifting, is the prophetic in you and bringing it to the community of God. And words like that shape and change who we are as a people because they come from God. And so God uses you in that. And so one word like that, one sentence, it sounds like a small bit of a small proverb, but somebody in this room's life could be changed forever by hearing that. Oh, actually, yeah, perhaps I should trust in God and not in my understanding of who I am or my own understanding of what's around me. So keep going, keep doing it. It's a fantastic word, small. So let me just talk about Peter. He gets out of the boat, doesn't he? And he's move on to the next slide. Oh yeah. I was trying to find out, can we walk on water today? I was looking for the current moment. Oh, I'm running out of time. Keep joking, it's pressing on time. This is the post-up of camels walking on human beings walking on water. Obviously, that's not what Jesus and Peter were doing. So what Peter does is click on the next one. Jesus immediately says to them, "Take courage, don't be afraid." Peter says, "Don't, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said, and Peter then got down out of the boat, walked across the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink and cried out, "Lord, save me." Quite often, when God calls us out of the boat, or he calls us to a plan or a mission in doing something, then sometimes we will find the difficulties around us. All of a sudden, our own fears will clamber in. So, for example, Brit is a worship leader. But when she first started leading worship, she could have been leading worship the first couple of times, made a few mistakes on the guitar, and she's like, am I really called to do this? Is this really what God's calling me? And all of a sudden, she's almost like, I need to not lead worship anymore. And all of a sudden, she's like sinking in the water because she's taken her eyes off of what God's called her to do, and that it's God calling her to lead worship. And it's God. Now, I don't know if made a mistake, they're probably not, because Brit does very seldom makes mistakes. But that's what could have hit her, and that could have been the sinking in the water for her, that sinking in the water moment where she's lost her focus on Jesus. And what he's doing, what Peter's doing, is like, well, my own understanding, Proverbs 3 again, my own understanding is that I'm going to sink in water. So he looks down, and lo and behold, he starts sinking, because his focus is off of the fact that it's a miracle. Christ is holding me up out of the water, and actually starts sinking. And that is potentially, he might lose his life at that point because he's sinking in the water. Next slide. But immediately Jesus reaches out his hands and caught him. So obviously Peter had got across the water enough before he started sinking. Jesus reaches out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Surely you are the Son of God." So he's in the boat, and he's sinking in the water, and Jesus catches him. And then Jesus tells him off. He says, "You of little faith." Because what he's saying is, what should have carried you across to me is your faith in me. So Brit, leading worship, her faith in God is what gives her the ability to stand in front of everyone and lead people in worship. She knows the people of God need to have worship leaders. That's how we do church. And so she steps out and is led in leading us in worship. This is a questioning of Peter's calling. So he questions himself in this. Am I really called to come across the water? Is Jesus, even if Jesus didn't do it, I'm just a human being. And so all of a sudden he's feeling, I don't know much what's going on here, I'm going to just sink. And so he says, the shortest prayer, it says that people ever prays in the Bible, he says, "Lord, save me." And so Jesus does. Save him. So I'm going to leave it there. One of the things I want to ask you guys is that when we step out and do things, whether it's in church, whether it's visiting to your friends, whether it's speaking to a friend who you know doesn't know Jesus and you want to tell them a bit about what your life with Jesus, or they ask you something and you want to answer a question, know that Jesus walks with you. And whilst Jesus walks with you and he takes hold of your hand, you do not sink in the water. And we know that Christ says in the Bible, he will never leave us as orphans, but he will be with us constantly. The Spirit walks with us constantly. When we speak to our friends who don't know Jesus, Jesus speaks through the Spirit inside us. When we walk into a room full of the lost people, Jesus walks into that room as well with us. And the power of God is capable of moving in any one of those moments. When you stand up and lead worship for the first time, God leads worship with you. When you sit down with someone who's breaking their heart over a broken relationship and you help pass them through that, God is with you when you're doing that. It's God who mends the broken heart. We can say words here and there, and we can say there and be kind, but it's God who mends the broken hearts. This is the power of God that moves. When you step out of the boat, it's God who moves in power. I have a friend who, this is the last story, I'm finished on the story. I've got a friend who she didn't have a boyfriend for as long as I knew her, and then she found this guy, and they got together and they were totally in love. And after so many months, they got engaged, and she was so excited about it. She was really excited, and for her, this was a real stepping out of the boat for her because she was so excited about getting married. And so she was a fantastic girl. She was a really, really good singer, absolutely amazing singer. But also she was the life and soul of the party. She was the sort of person who walked in. She was a girl who walked into the room, and everyone was like chatting to her, and she was making people laugh around her, and she was great. Now she was a very round girl. She was very round, and so when she got this, when her boyfriend asked her to get married, she was so excited, but she started going out and looking for wedding dresses, and she went into a high street and found a wedding dress shop, and she went to this when she wanted to think, right, I wanted to find out, I wanted to at least get some idea of what sort of wedding dresses I could would look good on me. So she goes into the shop and she says, she finds this wedding dress, and she says, I see this, and all the sizes are all really full sizes. And says the wedding dress for the lady who's in the shop, the owner of the shop, and says, have you got this in my size? And the woman looks at it and looks at it and says, no, it's not my size. And so she walks on, finds another one, and says, what about this dress? Have you got this one in my size? And she said, got sizes. And she says, no, I've told you, we haven't got that one in your size. And she's thinking, like, that's a different dress. And so she moves on and then finds another dress that she wants to try on. Then, have you got this one in my size? And the woman just turns around, darling, you do not need a wedding dress, you need a marquee. Oh. And if you can imagine, this is my friend, so I know her really well. She's absolutely, at that moment, when she's up here about getting married, all of a sudden she's just taken right down to the floor, and her life just collapses outside of her. And she's like in absolute distraught. She's in tears. She runs out of the shop. She's crying her eyes out. And as she runs out of the shop, she's absolutely in tears. She stepped out of the boat in saying, I'm going to get married. This was her stepping out of the boat. This is a big thing for her to say, I'm going to get married and have this day with, a wedding day. So this is what she's planning in her mind, and she's just been shattered. She runs out of the shop, and she's absolutely not in like little sniffles. She's blubbing. And as she steps out of the shop, there's this another woman standing outside the shop, looking at the shop, the dresses in the window. And she's like, crying her eyes out. And this woman is just, darling, what's the matter? What's wrong? What's wrong? And so she tells the story of what's happened in the shop. And she said, and the woman standing there looking at me into the shop window says, darling, don't worry. I've got a wedding dress shop. I'm down the road. I'm looking at the competition. I want you to come with me. I'll find you a dress. She goes with her. The woman finds her dress, gives it to her for free. And she gets a wedding dress of her dreams for free from this wedding dress owner. And she knows, if you talk to her about this story, she knows that was God walking with her by the moment. So when she stepped out, and when her sinking moment happened, and she's sinking in the water, a hand reached out to her, and that was God's hand. And it was God who arranged for that woman to be there at that moment in time, to give her a free wedding dress, designed and made for her, absolutely perfect, exactly what she wanted, and she loved it. And this was God holding her back. What I'm going to say to you guys is, when your moment comes, when God's going to ask you to step out of the boat, know that He will have your hand, and He will look after you, and He loves you, and He will not allow you to fall. Everybody makes mistakes, but He will look after you, and He will pick you up when things go wrong.